Human origins has become one of the most confusing stories in modern science because the old, clean narrative has collapsed. It used to be simple: a single birthplace, a single exodus, a single pure species marching out of Africa and replacing everyone else. Today, that story lies in pieces. We are told, sometimes by the same paleoanthropologist, that Homo sapiens may have been present outside of Africa 300,000 years ago, that modern humans emerged across Africa rather than in one place, and even that Homo sapiens might stretch back 1 million years. But we don't know what continent our species was born, but that recent out of Africa is still somehow valid. The result is a fog of mixed messages in which fossils, genetics and terminology no longer line up, and where out of Africa often seems to mean everything and nothing at the same time. What was once sold as a straightforward origin story has become a tangled web of overlapping populations, repeated migrations, hybridization and shifting definitions, leaving even specialists struggling to understand not just how we spread, but where, or even when, we truly began. However, a new DNA study may have put the nail in the coffin by showing that modern humans did not migrate from Sub-Saharan Africa as we are told. Instead, the population ancestral to non-Africans lived in North Africa and the Middle East, long before the supposed out-of-Africa migration, exposing out of Africa as a myth that no longer fits the evidence. The Takarakori genome study, which the media reported as a vague Green Sahara ghost population, delivers a fatal blow to the classic out-of-Africa model by demonstrating that an ancient North African population existed that was not descended from Sub-Saharan Africans or recent Eurasians, meaning modern humans did not emerge from a single African source population at all. This North African lineage, preserved in Takarakori and already present in Taforalt in southern Libya by 15,000 years ago, is genetically closer to the earliest Eurasians than to Yoruba or any other sub-Saharan group, cannot be explained by recent back migration, and carried basal mitochondrial Haplogroup N, whose earliest surviving branches appear in Europe and North Africa rather than East Africa. This means that the Takarakori-related ancestry entered Northwest Africa probably 130,000 to 90,000 years ago from the Middle East. According to the study, the individuals are ancient because they carry basal N, meaning they branch off before most later Eurasian maternal lineages diversified. Basal haplogroup N in Takarakori rules out a recent Eurasian back migration. The late Pleistocene North African Middle Eastern population occupied the same geographic interaction zone as modern North African Arab Persian populations, and later populations inherited that spatial structure even as their genetic makeup changed. The sapiens population likely extended into Greece, India and China at favourable times. Early European genomes such as Lati-Kun and Oase form basal Eurasian branches directly linked to this North Africa Middle East population, while sub-Saharan Africans preserve separate deep lineages, including ghost archaic ancestry showing that Africa itself was structured and peripheral to the population that generated global modern humans. Together, the genetic structure, haplogroup topology, Neanderthal admixture patterns, and long-ignored Levantine morphology demonstrate that what has been called out of Africa was in reality the expansion of a North African Middle Eastern metapopulation that dispersed into Eurasia and later moved back into Africa, collapsing the idea of a single African cradle and replacing it with a structured Afro-Eurasian origin for our species. In this study, they use the term out of Africa population to refer to early Eurasian genomes. This is deceptive wording. There is zero evidence that Lati-Kun and Oase are recent out-of-Africa populations. In fact, the study itself proves that early Eurasians did not come from Africa, and that out-of-Africa never happened, at least not from Ethiopia as they claimed. For more than 3 decades, the out-of-Africa model has functioned less as a hypothesis than as a conceptual default. It proposes that a single, relatively homogeneous population of anatomically modern humans evolved somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, usually placed in East Africa, and then expanded outward around 70,000 years ago, replacing all other human populations with minimal admixture. But this out-of-Africa bottleneck was really the Toba volcanic bottleneck 75,000 years ago, which decimated sapiens in South Asia. This model has survived not because it consistently fits the data, but because it provided a simple organizing story at a time when genetic sampling was sparse, fossil interpretation was uneven, and African population structure was poorly understood. The Takarakori study, together with earlier genomes such as Oase and Zlatikun, and long-ignored morphological evidence from the Levant and Europe, does not merely add complexity to Out of Africa. It breaks its core assumptions so thoroughly that the model can no longer be salvaged without being fundamentally rewritten. The first pillar of Out of Africa is the idea that Sub-Saharan Africans represent the ancestral population from which all non-Africans descend. Yoruba and similar West African populations have long been treated as stand-ins for this ancestral state, largely because they lack Neanderthal ancestry and were among the earliest African genomes to be sequenced. The Takarakori study directly undermines this assumption. It demonstrates that a deeply divergent North African population existed that split from Sub-Saharan Africans at roughly the same time that non-Africans split from Africans. In other words, the deepest split relevant to modern human origins is not between Africans and non-Africans, but within Africa itself. This alone is fatal to the idea of a single African source population. The North African population identified through Takarakori is not a recent Holocene phenomenon. Although the individuals themselves date to around 7,000 years ago, their ancestry does not. Their genome derives overwhelmingly from a lineage that was already ancient by then, one that had remained isolated within North Africa, while Sub-Saharan Africa followed a different evolutionary trajectory. This population is genetically closer to early Eurasians than to any Sub-Saharan African group, including Yoruba, Mbuti, or Nilotic populations. That relationship cannot be explained by recent back migration because the Takarakori population carries only minimal Neanderthal ancestry, far less than would be expected if it were derived from Eurasian migrants returning to Africa. Instead, it reflects shared ancestry within a broader Afro-Eurasian system that predates the supposed out-of-Africa event. The study also shows that long-standing interpretations of North African prehistory were wrong because the correct reference population was missing. Taforalt, the 15,000-year-old individuals from Morocco, had previously been described as having substantial Sub-Saharan African ancestry. That conclusion collapses when Takarakori is introduced into the analysis. The supposed Sub-Saharan component disappears and is revealed instead as North African ancestry. This matters because it demonstrates that North Africa was not a genetic blank slate, periodically refilled from the south or the north. It was a long-term population reservoir with its own deep history, one that has been mischaracterized simply because African population structure was flattened into an artificial north-south dichotomy. A second pillar of Out of Africa is the idea that the Sahara periodically became a green corridor that erased genetic structure across Africa. The Takarakori study directly contradicts this. Even during humid phases when the Sahara supported lakes, rivers and pastoralist activity, gene flow between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa remained limited. North African populations retained their distinct genetic profile across tens of thousands of years. This means Africa was not a single evolutionary arena in which populations mixed freely until one group emerged triumphant. It was a structured continent with long-lasting barriers, refugia, and divergent evolutionary paths. The truth is more complicated than just simple phrases and slogans, but anyone with any knowledge of Africa knows that it is not a single unified continent. The implications for the direction of human movement are profound. If North Africans are closer to early Eurasians than to Sub-Saharan Africans, then the flow of ancestry cannot have been simply outward from Sub-Saharan Africa. Instead, the data are more consistent with an Afro-Eurasian metapopulation centered in North Africa and the Middle East, from which populations expanded both northward into Europe and eastward into Asia, while other branches moved southward into Sub-Saharan Africa. This is not speculation layered onto the data. It is the only configuration that explains the observed genetic distances without resorting to ad hoc back migration scenarios. Early Eurasian genomes reinforce this picture. Zlati-Kun, dated to around 45,000 years ago in Central Europe, is the most basal non-African genome yet sequenced. Autosomally, it splits before all later Eurasians. Mitochondrially, it carries a basal form of Haplogroup N from Romania, slightly younger chronologically but even more striking genetically, also carries a basal N lineage and shows evidence of extremely recent Neanderthal admixture. These individuals do not look like descendants of a late homogeneous African exodus. They look like early offshoots of a population that was already structured, already widespread, and already interacting with Neanderthals at the margins of its range. Crucially, Haplogroup N itself does not support a simple African origin. While many derived branches of Haplogroup N are common in East Asia today, no basal N lineages are found there. The deepest Haplogroup N lineages appear in Europe and North Africa in Oase, Zlati-Kun, and Takarakori. This pattern is incompatible with an East Asian origin for Haplogroup N and equally incompatible with a Sub-Saharan African origin, where Haplogroup N is entirely absent. The coalescence age of Haplogroup N, around 60 to 70,000 years ago, does not date the population in which it arose, only the surviving maternal lineage. Earlier maternal lines almost certainly existed and were lost. Out of Africa repeatedly confuses lineage survival with population origin, a mistake the Takarakori study makes impossible to ignore. Morphology, long treated as subordinate to genetics, independently supports the same conclusion. Skul and Kafse, dated to roughly 120 to 90,000 years ago in the Levant, are anatomically more similar to later European modern humans than to many African fossils of comparable or even younger age. They do not resemble a peripheral African offshoot. They sit morphologically on a continuous trajectory that leads toward Upper Paleolithic Europeans. This continuity has been visible for decades, yet it was dismissed because it did not fit the out-of-Africa narrative. When genetics now shows that early Eurasians and North Africans share deep ancestry independent of Sub-Saharan Africa, the morphological signal suddenly makes sense. Skul and Kafse represent an early manifestation of the same meta-population that later produced Europeans and North Africans, not a failed dispersal, as out-of-Africa theorists have falsely claimed. Sub-Saharan Africa in this framework is no longer the cradle of modern humanity, but a complex mosaic, shaped by both deep survival and later admixture. Yoruba and other West African populations preserve extraordinarily old genetic lineages, including signals of introgression from deeply divergent ghost hominins. These archaic contributions are not evidence that Yoruba are ancestral to all humans. They are evidence that West Africa functioned as a refugium, where older lineages persisted and mixed with incoming populations. The fact that Yoruba are equally distant from North Africans and early Eurasians shows that they are not the source population for either. They are a product of into-Africa history, layered onto ancient African diversity. Sex-biased ancestry patterns reinforce this view. Paternal lineages in West Africa often trace back to expansions originating north of the equatorial rainforest, while maternal lineages retain deep local continuity. This asymmetry is exactly what would be expected if populations associated with the North Africa-Middle East corridor expanded southward and incorporated resident African populations. It is the same pattern seen in many prehistoric expansions worldwide. Out of Africa requires symmetrical ancestry flowing outward from a single source. The African data show the opposite. Taken together, the Takarakori study and related evidence dismantle out of Africa at every structural level. There is no single African population that can plausibly be identified as the ancestor of all modern humans. There is no genetic continuity from East Africa to early Eurasians that bypasses North Africa and the Middle East. There is no reason to treat Sub-Saharan Africans as proxies for ancestral humanity. There is no clean temporal boundary at 60,000 years that marks the emergence of modern humans as a global species. Instead, there is long-term population structure, overlapping dispersals, regional continuity, and asymmetric gene flow across Africa and Eurasia. What replaces out of Africa is not chaos, but a more realistic model, a North Africa-West Asian meta-population existing by at least the late Pleistocene, possibly earlier, embedded within a broader Afro-Eurasian network. This population gave rise to early Eurasians, such as Latikun and Owase, contributed ancestry to later Europeans and Asians, persisted in North Africa through climatic upheavals, and sent ancestry southward into Sub-Saharan Africa, where it mixed with deeply divergent local populations. Modern humans did not burst forth from a single African homeland and conquer the world. They emerged from a structured, interconnected system spanning Africa and Eurasia, with North Africa and the Levant at its core. The Takarakori study does not merely complicate out of Africa, it renders it obsolete. The model survives today largely as terminology and institutional inertia, not as an accurate description of human evolutionary history. Once North Africa is restored to its proper place, once early Eurasian genomes are taken seriously as basal rather than derivative, and once African population structure is acknowledged rather than flattened, the old story collapses under its own weight. What emerges in its place is not a denial of Africa's importance, but a richer, more honest account of humanity as a species shaped by deep structure, regional continuity, and movement in multiple directions over vast spans of time. Thanks for watching.